I'm Steve Brusatte. I'm a paleontologist. I dig up dinosaurs. I teach at the University of Edinburgh. I advise on films like the Jurassic World films, and I write pop science books like The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs and the new one called The Story of Birds.
The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs.
The story of dinosaurs actually begins in tragedy. Dinosaurs emerged from the worst mass extinction in the history of life, the closest life has ever come to completely dying out. And this happened about 250 million years ago at the end of what we call the Permian period of Earth history. And this was the time where there was the supercontinent, Pangaea. All of the land was gathered together as this one enormous landmass stretching from the North Pole to the South Pole. And it was a landmass that was ruled by a lot of early relatives and cousins and ancestors of us, distant mammal ancestors. But then, in what is now Siberia, these enormous volcanoes started to erupt about 250 million years ago. And these are not volcanoes like those that we know today. It's hard to even envision what these were like. These weren't the Hawaiian volcanoes or Mount Pinatubo blowing its top one day. No. These were enormous fissures in the earth. It's like the earth was slashed with a giant machete and it bled lava for millions of years. And as that lava came up through those cracks in the earth, it burnt its way through all the rocks. And that released unholy amounts of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases that warmed the atmosphere, led to runaway global warming, and that caused an extinction. And not just any extinction, but the granddaddy of all mass extinctions. 90 or 95% of all species died out. But there were a few plucky survivors. And among those survivors were some small little reptiles that had long arms and legs, that could move fast, that were agile, that were smart. And it's in those reptiles that we find the roots of the dinosaur family tree. Some of the fieldwork that I've done with friends and colleagues of mine in Europe has identified some of the first very tantalizing clues of those dinosaur ancestors living soon after that terrible extinction at the end of the Permian. And these are in many ways very meager clues because they are not nice, beautiful, complete skeletons like you might see in a museum. But they are tiny little footprints and handprints, just a few centimeters long. And we find them in Poland. And these little footprints, they were made about 250 million years ago. They were made by these little reptiles that we call dinosauromorphs, which were no bigger than a cat, than a pet cat that we might have. I could hold one of these in my arms. From those humble ancestors came the true dinosaurs. And the first true dinosaurs, we find their fossils about 230 million years ago in the Triassic period. And really, they're just distinguished by a few changes in the pelvis and the backbone that allowed them to walk more upright and move more quickly. And these very first dinosaurs, they split into the three major groups of dinosaurs. And these were the theropods, those are the meat-eating dinosaurs, the ones that would eventually become T-Rexes and velociraptors and birds. Then secondly, there's the sauropods and their close relatives. Those are the long-necked dinosaurs, the brontosauruses and platycuses and brachiosauruses. And then the third group is the ornithischian dinosaurs. And this is a whole variety of mostly plant-eating dinosaurs that had beaks and that could chew their food really well, like Triceratops. The ones with plates on their backs, like Stegosaurus. The duck-billed dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, the ones with the dome heads that headbutted each other. Those are all ornithischian dinosaurs. So, as you can see, there's this great diversity of dinosaurs that was starting to establish itself in the Triassic period on the supercontinent of Pangaea. But this was not an easy thing for these first dinosaurs to do because they had a lot of competition from the animals that were living with them, but they also were kept in check by the weather, by the climate. When it comes to the physical environment, Pangaea was not an easy place to live, not at all. This enormous supercontinent was so big that much of the interior was thousands of miles from the oceans, from the shoreline. So there were vast deserts covering much of the supercontinent. But the shorelines weren't really that much more hospitable because the shorelines were battered by storms, by what geologists call mega monsoons, which sounds very hyperbolic, but it is what they were. They were supersized monsoon systems. So that's the sort of weather and climate and environment that these early dinosaurs would have had to face. But also, they were in this battle of survival and this battle of evolution with other groups that had also survived that terrible extinction at the end of the Permian. And some of those groups were amphibians. The rivers and the lakes of Pangaea were ruled by salamanders the size of cars, with enormous heads with thousands of teeth. There were crocodiles and their relatives living all across Pangaea, and some of them were meat eaters, some of them were plant eaters. Some of them had beaks, like a turtle. Some of them had sails on their back. Some of them walk only on their hind legs. There was an enormous menagerie of fossil crocs, and these were the competitors of the very first dinosaurs, and there were more of these crocs. And they lived in more places, and they were more diverse in terms of their diets and their habits and the way that they lived. And so really the Triassic period, for many tens of millions of years, yes, dinosaurs were there. Yes, dinosaurs were diversifying, but they were really second-rate characters, B-list actors in this Pangaean drama, a drama that was headlined by the crocs and the giant salamanders. And it would have seemed like those animals would have kept going, kept evolving, kept thriving, kept dominating. But something happened. Something changed that story. Back at the end of the Triassic period, once again, another mass extinction. And this was caused by the breakup of the supercontinent. And you can see the legacy of that. South America and Africa look like two puzzle pieces that fit together because they once were together. And then Pangaea broke apart. And the earth bled lava. And it was a time of major volcanic eruptions all across what is now the Atlantic seaboard. And once again, as that lava came up, it burnt through the earth. It released a lot of carbon dioxide. It led to global warming. It led to an extinction. Not quite as bad as that one at the end of the Permian, about 50 million years earlier, but still one of the worst sudden moments of death in Earth history. And that extinction decimated the crocodiles. Almost all of them went extinct. Only a few species survived, the ancestors that led to the crocodiles of today. Same with those giant salamanders. Most of those died out. But the dinosaurs, they just sailed right on through that extinction. They were the great survivors of that extinction. They were the success stories. And because they passed through that extinction, they had the opportunity to diversify in this largely empty world in the next interval of time, the Jurassic period. Now, I wish I could tell you exactly why dinosaurs survived. But the truth is, I don't know the answer. Nobody really knows the answer. The answer must be out there. There's lots of different ideas that have been proposed. Maybe the dinosaurs could move faster. Maybe they were more intelligent. Maybe they had feathers to insulate their bodies against the whims of climate change. Many other ideas, but it's really hard to know. And so about 200 million years ago, the extinction happens, the volcanoes erupt, global warming causes a lot of species to die, dinosaurs make it through. Now, the Triassic period transitions into the Jurassic period. And there's a reason why the book, the film, is Jurassic Park, or the new ones that I work on are Jurassic World. And that's because it's in the Jurassic that dinosaurs truly become the stupendous, spectacular, sublime creatures that we all know and love. Giant meat eaters the size of buses, long-necked dinosaurs that got as big as Boeing 737 airplanes, the ones with horns and spikes and duckbills and dome heads and armor and all of those fantastic things that make dinosaurs so engaging. This is happening in the Jurassic period. And dinosaurs are diversifying so much in the Jurassic period, really for two reasons. First of all, they survived that extinction that killed off a lot of their competitors, so the playing field was largely empty, and dinosaurs had an opportunity. They were pioneers. They could go out and make their own destiny in this new evolutionary landscape. But also, Pangea is now breaking apart. What was once a single unified landmass is now fracturing into many bits and pieces, and the dinosaurs were along for the ride. And as these different continents budded off, broke off, spun off of Pangea, the dinosaurs adapted and changed as their environments changed. And from that, by the end of the Jurassic period, we had a whole stunning array of dinosaurs living all over the world, different species in different places, including some of the most famous dinosaurs of all, like Brontosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, living in the American West. And today we find their fossils in places like Colorado and Wyoming and Montana and Utah and the Dakotas. These are some of the richest fossil sites in the world, and it's Jurassic dinosaurs that we can find there. About 103 million years ago, the Jurassic transitions into the Cretaceous. And unlike many of the other transitions in Earth history between one period and another, this one is not marked by some great extinction or some spasm of volcanism or the impact of an asteroid. It really is just a line geologists use to divide a long time frame. But you have dinosaurs continuing to adapt and evolve as the continents move around. Now, where we really start to see a change is a little bit later in the Cretaceous, in the middle part of the Cretaceous. But here things get a little bit frustrating again, because the fossil record largely goes silent. We know things are changing because we can see that in the early Cretaceous, there are certain groups of dinosaurs that are dominant and diverse. You have things like the Spinosaurs with the sails on their backs and the long snouts that ate fish and swam around in the shallow water. You had big Carcharodontosaur predators. Then later on in the Cretaceous, they're gone or mostly gone, and you have tyrannosaurs and other major groups. But best we can tell from the rocks that we have and the fossils that we have, and especially the clues of the chemistry of the rocks, which can tell us a lot about temperature and precipitation and sea level and climate, it seems like there was a period of climate change, a period, again, of global warming, a period where sea levels were moving around. And out of that came new types of dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs that were able to survive that interval of climate change in the Middle Cretaceous, they were the ones that then had the opportunity to take over in the Late Cretaceous. But still, again, this is largely a mystery. By the latest Cretaceous, and I'm talking between about 80 million years ago and about 66 million years ago, by that time, the continents had moved around so much that Pangea was a distant memory, and a map of the world would have looked pretty similar to the world today. There were small differences. Sea level was much higher. There were no ice caps at the poles. India was an island in the middle of the ocean racing northwards to collide with Asia. But by and large, if you looked at that map, it would look similar to us. And on those different landmasses lived different dinosaurs. The ones in North America were quite distinct from the ones in South America and the ones in Africa. And where we really see that is with the top predators. The latest Cretaceous, this was the kingdom of T-Rex, but only in North America. There were other close tyrannosaur relatives that topped the food chain in Asia, but south of the equator, in South America, in Africa, it was totally different dinosaurs called abelisaurs, much more primitive dinosaurs that were the top predator. In Europe wasn't really even a continent. It was just a bunch of islands poking out of the sea. There were not many big dinosaurs there at all. There were a lot of smaller dinosaurs living on those islands, and it was little raptor dinosaurs that were the top dinosaur predators, and other groups of animals like the pterodactyls, which were not dinosaurs. These were another group of reptiles that could fly, but they were not dinosaurs. They were the biggest predators in many parts of Europe, and it's all because of the geography, because different continents, different land masses had different climate, different weather patterns, different environments, and that bred this richness of dinosaur diversity. And it really does seem that in the latest Cretaceous, this was the apex of dinosaur diversity. the time when they were thriving most, when there were most species, the largest number of species, different species living in different places, a world in which dinosaurs were firmly in control, even though it wouldn't last a whole lot longer. If you woke up on the last day of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago, you would have woken up to a world thrown into turmoil. This was an asteroid. And not just any asteroid, the biggest asteroid that was sniffing around our part of the solar system over the last 500 million years. It was about 6 miles wide, about 10 kilometers wide or so. So, a pretty sizable rock. And it smashed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico in a split second. And I mean that in a literal sense. In a split second, it detonated with more energy than a billion nuclear bombs put together. And it punched a hole in the face of the Earth over 100 miles wide, a crater that we can still see in parts of Mexico today. It's largely covered by the Gulf of Mexico, but parts of it are visible on land around Cancun. That asteroid, it triggered earthquakes, it triggered tsunamis, it triggered volcanoes going into overdrive, hurricane-force winds. The atmosphere got so hot from all of that energy that forests spontaneously combusted. There were wildfires all over the world. And those were the things that just happened in the first few minutes and hours and days after the asteroid hit. The real killer, though, was what happened over the next few weeks and months and years, and that is that the soot from those fires, the dust and the dirt and the grime from the collision of asteroid hitting Earth, all that stuff went up into the atmosphere. And there's currents in the atmosphere just like in the ocean. And that stuff spread all around the world, and it cloaked the Earth in darkness. It was a nuclear winter, a global winter that lasted for maybe a few years, maybe up to a decade or so. The Earth went dark and cold and silent. Plants did not have sunlight to photosynthesize to make their own food, so over a quite short period of time, plants died, forests collapsed. Plant-eating animals had very little to eat, they died. Then the meat-eaters. Ecosystems collapsed like houses of cards. And this led to a mass extinction. This is the most recent mass extinction to today, so it's the last one that happened. And 3 out of every 4 species died. So if you were living that morning before the asteroid hit, your entire species had a 25% chance of making it through. Everything bigger than a husky dog that lived on land died out. It was probably just too hard to get food, too hard to hide if you were big. But even a lot of smaller animals died as well. All of the dinosaurs, despite all of their previous successes, all of their millions of years of dominance, they died. Only one weird type of small, feisty, plucky, quite sophisticated dinosaur made it through. These were the dinosaurs with feathers and wings that could flap those wings and fly. These were the birds, the only dinosaurs that have survived to the present day. And many other animals died as well. The pterodactyls died. All the reptiles living in the oceans died. The ammonites, those beautiful coiled shells, they died in the ocean. But, of course, some things survived. And among the survivors, in addition to birds, were some tiny, furry, smart, feisty little creatures that could dig burrows and hide away and survive by their intelligence and by their endurance. And these were our mammal ancestors. We had ancestors that stared down that asteroid, and it's because they were able to endure this worst moment of Earth history. Because of that, that is why we are here today.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.